The room smelled of tea and old paper, a gentle haze of familiarity that pressed against her senses like a hand she had long forgotten to hold. She sat in the low light of the afternoon, the window open just enough for the late January wind to shift the curtains, and traced her fingers along the edges of photographs that had yellowed unevenly, letters that creased beneath her touch, as though remembering her touch too. Each scrap of memory seemed alive, though silent, humming with the faint residue of voices, laughter, and the tremulous warmth of hands that once pressed close, now gone. The ache in her knees reminded her of the years she had walked in careful, measured steps, of evenings spent leaning toward someone she loved, and nights spent withdrawing from the world to protect herself or her mother or some fragile illusion of safety. She lifted a photograph, a small rectangle of blurred faces, the smile of a young man with ink-stained hands and eyes that held her entire universe, and the memory returned without warning. He had been quiet in a way that demanded attention, not with words, but with presence. She remembered how he would linger near the piano, fingers brushing lightly over the keys, humming under his breath, paint smudged on his wrists from the easel he could never leave untended. His laughter was soft but immediate, filling the corners of her small apartment, a laughter that seemed to understand the spaces in her chest she had long thought empty. "Promise me you'll not vanish in the wind," he had said one evening, when the room smelled of roasted chestnuts and ink. She had smiled, unsure how to answer, because already she knew she could not belong entirely to the freedom he offered. Her mother's coughs echoed through the apartment, the rustle of medicine bottles and the fear that pressed against her chest like damp wool. Stability mattered more than desire then. She had learned that survival required sacrifice. He had knelt before her in the narrow hallway, the scent of linseed oil lingering on his hands, the light from the street lamp painting his face in a soft gold. The ring was modest, silver, with a small, unremarkable stone that gleamed as though it contained every possibility of their life together. "Marry me," he had said simply, the three words carrying a universe. And she had felt the world tilt sideways, not from love's presence, but from her own weight pressing against it. "I can't," she whispered, and the sound of her voice startled her even as it left him still, understanding yet shattered. She thought of her mother waiting at home, thought of the bills stacked in orderly lines on the kitchen counter, thought of the life that required her practical surrender. He had nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of resignation, and the world had contracted into a narrow corridor between what she desired and what she deemed necessary. Decades later, she could still feel the hollow ache of that refusal. The memory was no longer sharp, but soft and persistent, a low hum in her bones. The world moved on. Other men came, other faces pressed against her memory like water against stone. The adventurer whose smile had carried the scent of distant seas and foreign soil, whose hands had touched hers with reckless abandon. Their laughter had been volatile, tempestuous, and their kisses left marks that lingered longer than any conversation, reminders that desire could be both intoxicating and dangerous. She remembered evenings when the city seemed to tilt and sway beneath them, when the boundaries of propriety and caution dissolved in the heat of their closeness. He had been unpredictable, wild, a son she could admire but could never hold. She had left with a mixture of relief and longing, grateful to escape the volatility, and yet hollowed by the absence of the chaos she had secretly craved. Then there was the man who offered stability, who arrived like a gentle season, steady and predictable. He had quieted the storm within her with careful attentions, afternoon tea poured just so, letters delivered in envelopes scented with lavender, the patient rhythm of ordinary love. But his presence never stirred her heart, not truly. The comfort he offered was a blanket she could wrap around herself, but it never set her on fire. She loved him for what he could give, for the life she could build without anxiety. But she knew, even then, that she had bartered passion for safety, that she had learned a vocabulary of compromise. In this quiet room, the layering of these memories made the air thick with a history she could no longer escape. She lifted another photograph, one she had almost forgotten, and let the images dissolve into each other. The musician's quiet laughter, the adventurer's reckless grin, the steady man's gentle presence. Each left a mark, a pattern of light and shadow etched into the architecture of her heart. Her mind wandered back to the apartment where she had lived with the first, the true love of her life. She could see the faint traces of their routines, the delicate ways they had occupied the same space without overcrowding it. Mornings spent with tea and soft conversation, the sound of rain against the windows, his hand brushing hers as he passed. The ordinary had been extraordinary, each gesture imbued with a tenderness she now understood too late. She imagined, with a clarity that made her chest ache, the life they might have built together. Small rooms filled with art and music, afternoons of quiet reading, nights of laughter spilling into the streets. She could still hear the soft scrape of his chair against the wooden floor, still remember the faint scent of linseed oil and tobacco that clung to his clothes. The life she had chosen instead, the life of practical safety, was comfortable, yes, but it had never carried the same pulse of possibility. She leaned back in the chair, letting the letters flutter in her lap. Their edges were brittle, but she traced the inked words as though they were lifelines, as though she might draw the past back into the present if she pressed hard enough. There were letters from the adventurer, too, fragments of journeys and confessions of a desire that had been as fleeting as the wind. And the letters from the steady man, quiet affirmations of care, reminders that some choices, though emotionally uncharged, could still sustain. The afternoon light shifted, drawing shadows across the photographs. She felt a deep, patient ache, not a sudden grief, but the slow accumulation of decades of choice and consequence. She had loved, she had desired, she had compromised, and she had survived. The weight of memory pressed against her, and in that pressure there was also clarity. Love, she understood now, was a teacher that arrived in fragments, in whispers, in the small spaces between moments. It was not always grand or declarative. It often came in quiet insistence, in the small alignments of hands and hearts, in the courage to choose the unsteady path. And regret, too, was a teacher, arriving late, persistent, luminous in its capacity to reveal what mattered and what could not be bargained for. She set the letters aside, inhaled the mingled scent of tea and paper, and let the memories settle into themselves, like dust on the edge of a window pane. She could not change the past, could not reclaim the hands that had slipped from hers or the choices she had made in the dim light of necessity. But she could remember, fully and without shame, and in that act there was a strange, tender solace. In the quiet room, she was alone, yet surrounded by the echoes of love and desire, by the lingering presence of what she had held and what she had let go. And for the first time in many years, she allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement that she had loved, that she had chosen, and that she had learned, finally, that the heart, like memory, endured far longer than circumstance. The memory of him was a living thing, as tangible as the quilt draped across her lap now, as insistent as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She could remember the way he moved through the apartment, light-footed and deliberate, how he would hum when he painted or played a tune that had lodged itself in her chest like a secret she couldn't confess. He had a patience that seemed inexhaustible, as if time itself bent to the rhythm of his presence, and she had adored him for it. Mornings had been quiet, steeped in ritual. She would make the tea, steeped dark and fragrant, and he would pore over the letters she had received from her mother, correcting her mother's scrawled handwriting aloud with a gentle amusement that made her laugh. They shared the same small jokes, the same attentiveness to detail, the way a glance could say more than a sentence ever could. She remembered the warmth of his hands resting lightly on hers across the table, the unspoken promise in a brush of fingers. Every gesture was a declaration, but quiet, not grandiose, just enough to tether her heart without frightening it. She remembered the apartment as if it still breathed. The pale walls they had painted together, the streaks of green and ochre from his brush left where he had wiped his hands, the faint smell of linseed oil that never entirely left the room, the small brass keys that jingled whenever he opened a drawer. And in the evenings, they would sit by the window, curtains drawn back, listening to the city settle beneath them. The music of distant traffic, The occasional shout from the street, the whisper of wind over rooftops, all became part of the fabric of their togetherness. It was one such evening, when the light fell amber across the worn floorboards, that he proposed. She could feel the memory as though it had just happened. The soft scrape of his chair as he moved closer, the faint tremor in his voice, the way he avoided her eyes at first, then dared to meet them as he knelt. The ring, modest yet luminous, seemed to hold the weight of all possible futures. "Will you marry me?" he asked, almost cautiously, as if afraid that even words might frighten her. Her chest ached. She could not respond immediately, because she was already aware of the impossibility, the cruel tug of duty that had never loosened its grip. She thought of her mother, frail and reliant, of the bills stacked like small towers of inevitability on the kitchen counter, of the certainty of her own solitude should she surrender her responsibilities. I can't," she whispered, each syllable a fracture in the fragile world they had built. He did not protest, did not beg. He simply nodded, the shadow of pain crossing his face, a fleeting flicker of disbelief quickly replaced by understanding. That quiet acquiescence hurt more than any outburst ever could. The world, for a moment, seemed to shiver, the light in the room tilting, and she felt herself shrinking into the role she had chosen long before she met him: caretaker, survivor, practical woman. She had loved him then, and she loved him still, decades later, with a depth that neither time nor distance could erode. But she had chosen differently, and the consequences had unfurled slowly, imperceptibly. Her future relationships had been shaped by that decision: the need for security, the wariness of vulnerability, the quiet suspicion that love might be as fleeting as a melody that slips from memory. The adventurer had entered her life years later, after the young musician had drifted from her daily horizon. He had carried with him a chaos she had not known she craved: sudden trips, letters written from foreign ports, laughter that could unsettle the entire room. Their affair was passionate, consuming, and unbalanced. He was intoxicating, unpredictable, and she followed willingly, aware of the danger even as she reveled in it. She remembered one night particularly vividly, a warm spring evening on a balcony overlooking the river. He had lit a cigarette and leaned against the railing, the orange glow a tiny sun in the darkness, and she had leaned into him, smelling the salt of the sea and the faint spice of foreign lands. "You make the world feel sharp," he had murmured. She had laughed softly, knowing that sharpness could wound as easily as it could excite. Their passion was like fire, bright, sudden, impossible to contain. And yet just as quickly it dissipated, leaving her with the lingering heat of desire and the cold shadow of uncertainty. She had learned caution through him, had discovered that the heart could ache not only from absence but from presence, from intensity, from the knowledge that what you most crave may be precisely what cannot remain. Then there was the man who offered her stability. He had appeared later still like a slow tide, unassuming, steady, almost unremarkable. And yet, in the quiet rhythms of daily life, she had come to appreciate him. He never stirred her heart in the way the first or the adventurer had, but he offered continuity, a gentle reassurance that some forms of love were neither tumultuous nor tragic, merely enduring. Tea in the mornings, careful attention to her small habits, letters delivered with a lavender scent. These were acts of love she could rely upon. And yet, for all their comfort, she sometimes caught herself staring out the window, remembering hands that had been warmer, laughter that had been sharper, and wondering what she had lost in choosing prudence over abandon. Her body now ached in ways that made her acutely aware of time's passage, knees stiff, joints creaking, skin thin and memory-laden. Yet the interior life remained vibrant, as alive as ever, a realm where the young musician's fingers could still brush against hers, where the adventurer's reckless grin could still ignite her pulse, and where the steady man's patient smile offered a soft, grounding light. Each recollection overlapped, blurred, and sometimes collided, as memory tends to do, creating an interior landscape both luminous and sorrowful. She thought of her mother, whose presence had loomed over her early choices and the small, quiet sacrifices that had seemed necessary at the time. How curious it was now to see that love could endure beyond choice, that it could linger, unspoken, even when practicality had guided her hands. She traced her fingers over another photograph, one taken in a moment of laughter, her head thrown back, hair catching the sunlight, and she realized that even in the absence of grand gestures, the texture of love was tangible, held in small movements, in shared space, in recognition of another's rhythm. Memory, she realized, had become a kind of sanctuary. Each echo, each lingering scent or sound, carried with it lessons too subtle to be heeded in youth. The quiet ache of what if had become paradoxically a source of clarity. She understood the cost of her choices without needing to alter them, understood that human connection, in whatever form it takes, imprints itself in ways both tender and irrevocable. She allowed herself a rare indulgence, imagining what might have been had she chosen differently. A life with the musician, the afternoons of music and painting, nights spent speaking in the low, tremulous intimacy that comes when two lives entwine without fear or reservation. A fleeting fantasy of escape with the adventurer, the exhilaration of unanchored love, the gentle constancy of the man who had offered her security, a life steady and predictable, devoid of the fires of passion. And in each of these imaginings she recognized herself, the same woman, present and attentive, learning, loving, losing, enduring. Time, she realized, had been a patient witness to all of it, to the moments of love that had blossomed and withered, to the choices made in the soft pressure of necessity, to the quiet aftermath of longing and regret. And though the years had pressed upon her, though she had endured loss and compromise, she had survived. She had learned, finally, that the heart's resilience is measured not in the absence of pain, but in the depth of attention paid to its rhythms, in the courage to remember fully and without reservation. She set the letters aside, letting them rest in the sunlit corner of the room, and closed her eyes. She could still hear his laughter, still feel the gentle weight of a hand in hers. She could recall the adventurer's fire, the steady man's comfort, and she could, with gentle ownership, accept that each had shaped her, each had taught her, each had been a necessary step in the unfolding of her own heart. The room was quiet once more. Tea had cooled in the cup beside her, the light had shifted, shadows deepened, and she was left with the interior landscape of a life fully lived, marked by love, by longing, by choices both painful and wise. And in that quiet reflection, she felt a strange, luminous peace, that she had loved deeply, that she had erred, that she had survived. Memory pressed around her like a warm, persistent tide, and she let it wash over her, not with longing, not with regret, but with the quiet acknowledgement that she had lived and learned, fully and without shame. She could hear the rain tapping against the window, the steady, muted rhythm that always reminded her of evenings spent with the musician, both of them curled on the faded sofa, a book open between them, their fingers occasionally brushing over pages, over hands, over lives not yet fully known. He had hummed softly then, a melody she could never forget, low and wandering, slipping into the folds of the room. Even now, decades later, the sound lingered behind her eyes whenever she closed them. There had been mornings with the adventurer, coffee bitter and thick, poured hastily into chipped mugs, laughter spilling over the table as sunlight struck through the half-drawn curtains, dust motes dancing in the gold of the air. He had leaned back in the chair, head thrown just slightly, and she remembered thinking, even then, that desire could be a weight as much as a thrill. The smell of tobacco mixed with sea salt had clung to his jacket, and she had inhaled it like a promise she knew she could not keep. Then, the man of steadiness, how different those mornings were. The tea measured, the letters folded carefully and stacked on the table, the faint scent of lavender pressing into the corners of the room. There had been an economy of touch with him, precise and intentional, never urgent, never overwhelming. And yet in that predictability she had sometimes felt a quiet relief, a sense of safety that had been both balm and cage. She traced her fingers over the letters again, letting the edges cut faintly into her skin. One was from the musician, written in a hand that trembled slightly, the ink smudged where his fingers had lingered too long. "I think of you," it said, "in the mornings when the light strikes the floor like a question I cannot answer." She remembered holding it close to her chest, the paper damp with a touch she could still feel. She had chosen stability over that uncertainty, and yet the paper had always reminded her of what she had left behind. There were afternoons of walking through the city streets, the adventurer beside her, arms brushing, his voice telling stories of faraway ports, of markets filled with color and noise, of deserts where the sand seemed to swallow the horizon whole. She had leaned into his stories, feeling herself pulled toward a life she knew she could not inhabit long term, a life of motion and risk, of pleasure and peril intertwined. And when the streets emptied, when the noise fell away, she had sometimes felt the ache of impermanence, the sense that what was thrilling today might be gone tomorrow, leaving only memory and desire. Even with the steady man, there were moments that lingered, small ones that might have seemed trivial but had left traces. The way he would notice when she paused before selecting tea leaves, offering the one she preferred without asking. The faint tremor in his voice when he read aloud from a letter she had received. The softness of his hands as they brushed hers in passing, careful and deliberate. Each moment was weighted with quiet intention, an insistence that love need not be dramatic to exist, and that devotion could be measured in consistency as well as fire. Memory, in its layering, did not obey chronology. Sometimes the scent of tea brought her back to her mother's kitchen, the small clatter of spoons and cups, the soft cough that had haunted her youth. Sometimes the creak of a floorboard summoned the musician's presence, even though he had long left her life, his handprints lingering like the faint warmth of a long-gone sun. And at other times, a sudden gust of wind would carry with it the sharp tang of adventure, of distant lands, of the man who had promised her the thrill of unrestrained desire, but had ultimately left her grasping at absence. She allowed herself to imagine again, briefly, the apartment they might have shared, the musician and she, each morning starting with tea, a song, a painting, a life where the streets of the city were navigated together, not alone, where laughter came easy and sorrow was shared. Then the vision blurred into a balcony over the river, the adventurer leaning close, wind and cigarette smoke tangling, and she felt the pull of excitement she had once surrendered for practicality. And finally, a quiet living room with the steady man, the scent of lavender in the corners, soft music in the background, the comfort of being known without risk, without thrill, but also without the sting of longing. Decades had passed, yet the ache of what if was not bitter so much as luminous. It was a light that illuminated the interior landscape of her life, the folds and creases, the choices made and unmade, the quiet echo of hands once held and faces now gone. She realized with a gentle clarity that the sum of these memories, the tender, the thrilling, the safe, had shaped the woman she had become. Love had arrived in multiple forms, and she had received it in the measure she was ready for at each stage, even when she had misunderstood its meaning. In the room, sunlight shifted again, pooling over the photographs, over the letters, over the faint traces of tea and paper. She felt her own heartbeat in the quiet, a reminder that even when time presses, even when the body betrays, the interior life remains vivid, a repository of connection and feeling that endures long after the voices have faded. She leaned back, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of decades settle evenly across her chest. The hands that had trembled with longing and the heart that had known desire and loss were hers to keep, unbroken and intact. Memory, in all its layered persistence, was a gift, a record of love, of choice, of the complex and sometimes painful beauty of living. And for the first time in many years, she smiled, not with longing, not with regret, but with ownership, the kind that comes only after a life fully lived. She had loved, she had erred, she had survived. And she had learned that love, in all its forms, mattered more than comfort, more than certainty, and that the ache of what might have been could coexist with the quiet peace of acceptance. She let the letters rest, the photographs settle, and the room breathe with her. The wind stirred the curtains once more, and she allowed herself to simply be, a woman shaped by decades of love, desire, compromise, and memory, holding in her chest the full measure of a life remembered and understood. And in that quiet, unhurried moment, she recognized the truth she had known all along, that love, tender, wild, or steady, was the teacher, the constant witness, the light illuminating even the shadows of her choices.